At close of day I hear the gentle rain, while experts on the radio explain my numbing numbers rising by the day, ciphers of unimaginable pain. Behind each number one beloved face, a light in life whom no one can replace, leaves on this world a signature, a trace, a gleaning and a memory of grace. All loved and loving, carried to the grave, the ones whom every effort could not save. Amongst them all those carers whose strong love bought life for others with the lives they gave. So Roger, after this collaboration which of COVID necessity was sort of via the internet and the wonders of Zoom, which you've turned into an iconostasis, we are actually meeting, not quite with a flask of wine and a loaf of bread, but to consider Rubaiyat as well. And I had showed you, but again only electronically, this lovely Folio Society edition of the Rubaiyat in Fitzgerald's translation, which has inspired me so much, which has these wonderful, very early Persian miniatures, and I know that was part of your inspiration when we decided that we would make a new Rubaiyat. I'd perhaps you'd like to talk about that and about your beautiful miniatures.
Aren't these fantastic? I mean, I've always been fascinated, as have a lot of artists actually, by these sort of Persian miniatures, because they're almost a kind of parallel tradition to the sort of Western Christian illuminated Gospels and illuminated manuscript happening almost exactly the same time. But whereas in Christendom they were the sort of Gospels and the Psalms and so on, because there was the wariness in the Islamic world about actually using images, they tended to be for classic Persian poetry instead.
Right, yeah.
And so, but it was an amazing tradition, and they did them with these wonderful backgrounds, which had, I mean, the ones here are beautiful. I mean, they're like kind of Persian carpets, really, aren't
yes,
they?
Exactly. Well, and again, of course, that partly rises out of the Islamic thing where you, because of the hesitancy about image, there's a highly developed art of pattern and abstraction, isn't there?
Yes.
But the contrast between that and then the beautiful image is pretty extraordinary. It's wonderful.
Yes, no, that's right, and it just somehow this sort of I mean, I love the way actually the text sort of shoots out of the
yes, yeah.
So because there's a wonderful somehow the framing gives a different layer of meaning to the image, and so that's very much what I was thinking of when you invited me to do this, and to try and think what could possibly.
Well, yes, and I felt these were so much more than just a sort of illustration. They weren't simply slavishly with what the text was doing, but developing and opening out ideas in the text. I mean, the one you have of I talked about Eros in Piccadilly Circus, the little love god languishes alone, but you have him in a kind of, it's wonderful kind of rich blue and sort of flooded the water. That's a moment of real invention, which I think develops the poem. And again, what you did when I wrote the one about Zoom, there's a development in the poem as I write it, from thinking you've got complete freedom and you'll never have to work again sort of thing, and then suddenly realizing, no, you're going to have a series of Zoom meetings. And I talked about the way that teases us with an apparent closeness and yet emphasizes distance, and longed for the communion that we might have at the end. But you took that in a new direction with this beautiful idea of the gallery view on Zoom as a kind of iconostasis.
Yes.
And then I didn't notice it at first that, you know, where people are just giving their name, you know,
Yes,
they don't
and that's right.
you put
Sounds
Alpha and Omega, you know, so that sense of Christ there, doubly the I am the Alpha and the Omega. I
Well,
thought that
you
was
have
beautiful.
that line about some have left the meeting long
Long
ago, which I
before.
thought was really poignant kind of
Yeah.
thing. And actually, that's exactly what happens on Zoom.
Yeah,
people
people
disappear.
leave. Well, and some, of course, I was really riffing there, and one of the reasons for enjoying the Rubaiyat in a new way and poignantly during this COVID crisis was that, of course, underlying the entire poem, in spite of its exquisite moments of sensual appreciation of the good things of this life, the loaf of bread, the flask of wine, and thou beside me in the wilderness, all of that is underpinned by a sense of mortality. And it finishes with Omar Khayyam imagining his own grave and imagining the beloved to whom the poem is written turning down an empty glass.
Yes,
And
yes.
the celebration of the rose, you know, as the symbol at once of our flourishing and of our decay, you know. I mean, in the original poem, you know, I sometimes think that never blows so red the rose as where some buried Caesar bled, and every hyacinth the garden wears dropped in its lap from some once lovely head. And I picked up the rose image from that. So, but anyway, I'm saying what you've done, I think, with the illustration is to take a suggestion in the poem and then make your own, as it were, visual poetic response, rather than simply, you know, illustrating in a strict sense. And I really appreciated that. It does seem to me it makes it a collaborative work in a quite strong way.
Well, that was what's such fun to do. And as I say, the starting point for this was really deciding how to frame the pictures, because I though it would have been wonderful to do these are really elaborate kind of things, I just didn't feel that was the partly the context that we were writing them in was.
Yeah. Well, this is the first time I've seen these on this very special paper that you wrote to me about out of your Syrian journey. So do talk about that, because I'm seeing. I mean, I could see it with the very, very beautiful reproductions of them in this, but I could see that the texture of the paper is very much part of the picture. It must affect the whole way the paint stays on and everything.
Yeah, well, it's a gorgeous. I mean, there's a wonderful story of this paper. I try not to go on too long about it, but I actually got it from a wonderful shop called Lawrence's, which is makes wood engravings, which I used with some of my early poems, and it was an amazing Dickensian kind of place that. When I first went to, its workshop was actually in the top of a house in Bleeding Heart Yard, which was the most Dickensian place you can imagine.
Yeah.
And you had to go up this wooden staircase, and you couldn't actually get into the shop. You had to ring a bell, and after a while, you heard footsteps coming down. The doors flung open, and someone said, "What do you want?"
That's
If you don't know what you want, you shouldn't come here. Slams the door.
That's wonderful. I'm glad these Dickensian places still exist.
Well,
you know.
fortunately, it's no longer quite like that. And when you got up to the top of when we finally got admitted, there was a notice on the wall saying, "If customers object to the prices, they may take their custom elsewhere." Which, as there was no elsewhere, but I could see behind the counter these amazing stacks of paper, and I was just edging towards it, and suddenly this little man, who actually turned out to be old Mr. Lawrence, jumped out and said, "I stand there, you stand there." So I wasn't able to get the paper then, but years later I went back there, and it had been taken over by his son. It was all completely different, and this time when he went up, it was all open plan. There were sofas. Would you like a cappuccino?
Yeah.
But I got this extraordinary paper, which actually I think came from Nepal, and a lady with a
Nepalese,
camper van used to get it, and I used it when I went to Syria and was painting the stylites.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Things. I just felt this had a kind of desert sort of feel to it. And it just seemed
It's almost as if you're painting on the wilderness, painting on the desert
that's right.
sands.
So I mean, with that sort of beginning of the thou in the wilderness.
Well, wilderness, of course, was another of the Omar Khayyam themes that returned in my poetry. the sense of the return. You know, I actually the only place where I make some direct allusions, you know, the morning and the bowl of night, so on, but the place where I directly quote 2 lines of the poem in my poem, which is the section in my poem about this extraordinary return of wildlife.
Yes,
And the greening and cleaning of things as we let nature rest a little bit. So I quoted, "They say the lion and the lizard keep the courts where Yamshed gloried and drank deep," you know, and that Khayyam, as part of reminding us of our mortality and the vanity of human wishes, you know, to borrow Samuel Johnson's phrase, that really comes over, I think, in the way we've had to reassess our priorities I wonder if actually this might be an occasion just to read that part, which I don't think I've read publicly before. And this was your wonderful, wonderful painting.
Yes, well, I actually found a photograph that an Italian photographer had just seen this flamingo walking across the
and then there are
street.
other wild animals walking across.
I added the little sheep going in the other direction.
And it's at the end of this, so this is actually the longest segment of it, and I try and say, well, what are we going to learn from this? You know, we can't go back to the way we were, and, you know, perhaps the new normal will be an improvement. So let me read it. This is section 6, the penultimate section. "They say the lion and the lizard keep the courts where Yamshed gloried and drank deep. But now, in every corner of the world, the wild things flourish while the cities sleep. For when they see our influence abate, the banished creatures soon resume their state. Blithe dolphins sport along the Grand Canal, coyotes call across the Golden Gate. The grass grows green in every city square. The little foxes, once so shy and rare, saunter our streets and boulevards by day, whilst birds and insects throng the cleaner air. How soon the tide of nature has returned, how soon renew the forests that we burned, how soon they seed and repossess our streets, those precious plants and animals we spurned. Perhaps in all this crisis, all this pain, this reassessment of our loss and gain, nature rebukes our brief authority, yet offers us the chance to start again, and this time with a new humility, with chastened awe and mutual courtesy, to re-accept the unearned gift of life with gratitude, with joy and charity. Perhaps we'll learn to live without so much, to nurture and to cherish, not to clutch. And if I'm spared, I'll hold the years I'm given with gentler tenure and a lighter touch." So, of course, in that one I had not just the direct quote from Omar Khayyam, but a little allusion to Isabella's speech in Measure for Measure, the phrase about nature rebukes our brief authority. I always find that so telling, those lines, "Man, proud man, dressed in a little brief authority, plays such fantastic tricks before high heaven as makes the angels weep." No, so anyway, of course, what happened with these poems was that we moved from the kind of a lighter touch at the beginning into something more
it's got a real progression,
and it was a genuine progression, because they were literally Quarantine Quatrains. I started them in March, you know, late March, as the lockdown began to take hold, and finished them in early May. So it was that first phase of lockdown, and eventually, of course, we had these terrible numbers coming through, and so I wrote an elegy at the end of it, particularly thinking about the care workers who had been infected, and that's why I wanted us to dedicate it, you know, to the care workers charity, and not just dedicate it, but that all. I mean, it's been very good of you to give all your labour. Your labour is really longer than mine. But so you know, we take nothing from this. But once the cost of printing and postage is covered, then everything goes to the Care Workers Charity. And we've had good collaboration with Emily from the Care Workers Charity to get on board with this, which has been good.
Yeah, which will be. I mean, hopefully it'll be a really.
Yeah. Well, I think we should
positive
certainly.
thing
I mean,
to
if we
come out of
sell
it.
all the 600 numbered and signed copies, then I think we should certainly be looking at £4,000 or £5,000 for them at least, possibly more.
That'd be really great. Should we perhaps end with one last of the poems, which is one of the illustrations that I actually haven't quite finished. I've noticed,
right.
having put it in the book, because it's the one of which is almost. I mean, the original poem almost begins, doesn't it, with Omar Khayyam talking about wine.
Oh yes, yeah. Well, wine had to find its way in there, and I thought, well, I can't write a new Rubaiyat without all that lovely stuff about he's in the tavern and he says he wonders what the vintners ever buy, one half so precious as the goods they sell,
Yeah.
And so I decided to have a little encomium of wine. I was very fortunate that my cellar was well stocked before the thing started, so I wasn't completely at a loss.
Yeah. So well, this is the one illustration which I put you into.
I was delighted when that one came through. And I have a little hut called the Temple of Peace, which I name the Temple of Peace because Gladstone always used to call his library the Temple of Peace. But of course, it's not really a temple; it's a kind of wooden thing. It's a glorified gazebo. But I was delighted that you made it a proper temple.
Yes.
And you have me gesturing with the wine.
With the wine.
And the wine on the table.
And the wine on the table. And that's the bit that I've just realised that I should, of course, have put a loaf of bread, because that, I mean, partly that's in the original Rubaiyat, it's a loaf of bread.
So a glass of wine, a loaf of bread, and thou beside me in the wilderness. Yeah.
But also it has these other sort of obviously.
Well, yes, of course. When I was writing this, I was thinking also about this terrible exile from churches, and so from the Divine Sacrament and from Holy Communion. And the other poem that was in my mind as I wrote this particular section was, of course, Hilaire Belloc's brilliant heroic poem in praise of wine. Yeah. And that has this wonderful image at the end where he calls on Christ to bring the cup to him. Right. He turns it from a classical to a Christian poem just at the very end.
Yes.
And of course, the other image we have of drinking the cup is, coming to our end, and so I brought all that in, but it starts with just the sheer joy, and gives you a little tour of my cellar as it happens. So this is segment 2. I think of old Khayyam, who stood before the tavern shouting, "Open up the door," and wish I might carouse the night with him. Alas, that such carousals are no more. I'll keep the rules my country has imposed. My life, like my small garden, is enclosed, but still I'll raise a glass and pledge my friends, although for us the tavern door is closed. For in my cellar, ranged in dusty rows, are sleeping poets, waiting to disclose deep memories of Saint-Emilion, whose vineyards reach to where the Dordogne flows. And with these wines I travel where I please, from Rhineland to the lofty Pyrenees. I saunter through the chateaux of the Loire, drawing the cork on any one of these. So with the poets, let me praise the vine and pledge my absent friends in vintage wine, sensing sometimes the savour at my lips speaks of a love both human and divine. And when I come to taste my life's last drop, when all that flowed in me comes to a stop, then let me see my Saviour pledge his love, come close to me and help me drink the cup.
Well,
yes.
cheers.
Cheers. Anyway, it's wonderful to meet in this carefully socially distanced and COVID-friendly way in a beautiful garden that I think Omar Khayyam himself would have appreciated. Thanks to Philippa for lending us that venue.
Yeah.
And this is now going to go out into the world, I hope, and you've done all your signing already, and I shall do all mine. And here is number 1, which we have both signed, limited edition of 600 copies, copy number 1.
Wonderful.
Roger Wagner, Malcolm Guite. So I bless this poem as it goes into the world.
Amen.
The sun sets and I find myself in prayer, lifting aloft the sorrow that we share, feeling for words of hope amidst despair. I voice my vespers through the quiet air. O Christ who suffers with us, hold us close. Deep in the secret garden of the rose, raise over us the banner of your love, and raise us up beyond our last